The cursor blinked on the monitor, steady and rhythmic. Rachel Morgan adjusted her keyboard, the blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes. This was the first day of her remote recruiting position. No commute, no office politics, just the quiet hum of a laptop in a room that was entirely hers. She reached for her coffee, but her hand paused midair. The silence of the house pulled her mind back 20 years. She saw her parents at the kitchen table, stacks of bills spread out like a map of a territory they could never conquer. They worked until their backs ached and their hands grew calloused. Yet the end of every month brought the same quiet tension. They were runners on a treadmill, moving fast but staying exactly where they started. Rachel pulled her hand back from the desk. She had spent a lifetime watching that cycle repeat. She looked at the job application on her screen, not just as a source of income, but as a tool. She was not here to repeat their history. She was here to rewrite it. The room felt smaller now, charged with a sudden sharp clarity. The work began. The first commission checks arrived, larger than any paycheck she had ever seen. The numbers on the stubs felt like validation. Her coworkers immediately traded their bonuses for tangible status. They returned to the office talking about new vehicle leases, exotic vacations, and high-end watches. The temptation was a physical weight. It was easier to spend, to blend in, to feel the immediate reward of a life upgraded. Rachel watched them. She saw the cycle of consumption accelerate. She took a deep breath and looked at her own bank account. The urge to join them pricked at her resolve, but she stopped. She pulled a book from her shelf, found the passage she had marked, and reread the core principle. Successful people assign a definite purpose to their money. She took a pen and wrote a single word on a sticky note: freedom. She stared at the paper. This was not about saving for a rainy day. This was about buying the power to own her own time. She split her check, setting aside the portion for her future, and closed the laptop. The luxury items her coworkers bought would lose their value in months. Her freedom would only compound. She had made her choice. The plan was simple, but the execution felt like walking through deep water. Every month, Rachel funneled the majority of her commissions into her brokerage account. The money vanished from her liquid balance, leaving her with just enough to cover the essentials. Her bank statement became a source of friction. The numbers grew at a snail's pace, barely moving while her friends flaunted their new lives. She saw their photos from distant beaches and heard their stories of high-end purchases. The contrast was sharp. It gnawed at her. There were nights she sat at her desk, staring at the screen, wondering if she was sacrificing too much for a future that felt decades away. She felt the pull to loosen her grip, to spend just a little, to join the rhythm of the life happening around her. Every time the doubt took root, she opened her investment portfolio. She looked at the holdings, not as numbers, but as seeds. She reminded herself that wealth was not about what she could show off today, but what she could control tomorrow. She closed the accounts, turned off the screen, and focused back on the work. The grind was agonizing, but she refused to blink. The office was quiet, save for the hum of her laptop cooling fan. Rachel sat in her small, unadorned apartment, her workspace minimalist and functional. A colleague stopped by her desk during a video call break, eyes sweeping over the sparse shelves and the lack of expensive decor. He checked his phone, showing off a photo of a new luxury vehicle he had just purchased. He looked at Rachel, then at her screen, and shook his head. He asked why she continued to live like a student when her commission checks were among the highest in the firm. He pointed at the walls, suggesting she move to something that reflected her actual status. Rachel did not look away from her monitor. She paused her work, turned her chair, and met his gaze. She said, "I am building a life I do not have to escape from." The silence that followed was heavy. The colleague shifted, his smile fading as he realized the depth of the boundary she had drawn. He turned and walked away, leaving Rachel alone in the quiet. She did not feel the need to explain further. She looked back at her screen, refreshed her investment dashboard, and dove back into the next candidate search. The judgment of others was a small price to pay for the autonomy she was methodically constructing. The news cycle turned frantic. Market charts bled red, showing steep, jagged declines that wiped away months of incremental gains in a single afternoon. Rachel watched the numbers plummet. Her brokerage account value cratered. the screen reflecting a loss that would have sent most investors into a panic. Her pulse quickened. The urge to sell, to salvage what remained and wait for the dust to settle, roared in her mind. It was a visceral, raw fear. She gripped the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. She looked at the sell button, then at her original plan. Buffett's philosophy echoed in her head. She realized the market was not failing, it was on sale. She took a breath, ignored the reports of global financial instability, and opened her transfer portal instead. She moved a significant portion of her cash reserves into the market while prices touched the floor. She did not look at the account for 3 days. When she finally logged back in, the panic had subsided. The market had begun its slow, jagged climb back toward the surface. She had not lost. She had bought the dip. She closed the browser, her hands steady, and returned to her recruiting work with a sense of calm. The recruiting cycle continued, but the numbers on her screen began to tell a different story. Rachel logged into her brokerage account during a quiet Tuesday afternoon. She pulled up the monthly performance report, expecting the usual steady, incremental climb. Instead, she saw a surge. The market returns for the quarter had outpaced her entire salary from the same period. She stared at the digits, then opened a spreadsheet to double-check the math. She input her monthly commission, then the passive dividend and interest totals. She ran the numbers twice. The passive income was no longer a supplement, it was the primary engine. For years, she had pushed the boulder uphill, contributing every spare cent to the portfolio. Now the boulder had momentum. The compounding effect had crossed a critical threshold, turning the friction of her early sacrifices into a gravitational pull of its own. She pushed her chair back from the desk, the air in the room suddenly feeling lighter. Her recruiting commissions were still substantial, but they were no longer the sole anchor of her financial life. The machine was running on its own. She watched the cursor blink on her screen, the realization setting in that the period of pure, grueling accumulation had reached its pivot point. The final contract arrived in her inbox at 5 in the afternoon. Rachel spent the next hour navigating the last requirements of the high-profile search, guiding the candidate through the final sign-off. She hit the submit button on the placement confirmation, closed the recruiting portal, and cleared her desktop of all active work windows. Her hands felt heavy. This was the result of years of disciplined, repetitive action. She reached for her mouse, the plastic cool against her palm. She navigated to the brokerage site, her movements slow and deliberate. She entered her credentials, key by key, hearing the faint click of the mechanical keyboard echoing in the quiet office. The page loaded, the progress bar crawling across the top of the monitor. She did not rush. She leaned back, letting out a long, measured breath, and stared at the login field. The site requested a final verification code sent to her phone. She picked up the device, entered the 6 digits, and pressed the final Enter command. The screen flickered, the server processing the request. She sat motionless, her eyes locked on the white space where her total balance would materialize. The tension in the room was absolute. The screen refreshed, and the numbers snapped into focus. 1 comma, then another. A 1 followed by 6 zeros. The total balance sat motionless against the white background of the browser. Rachel did not blink. She leaned forward, her face mere inches from the monitor, tracing the digits with her eyes to ensure she was not misreading the decimal point. It was there. 7 digits. The room remained silent, but the hum of the cooling fan seemed to fade into the background. She pulled her hands back from the desk and folded them in her lap. Her shoulders dropped 2 inches, the tension that had anchored her spine for a decade finally releasing. She looked at the clock on the wall, noting the exact time, and then back at the screen. The number did not shift. It was not a projection or a forecast. It was a recorded reality. She stood up, walked to the far wall of the office, and turned back to look at the desk from a distance. The laptop sat open, a small rectangle of light in the dimming office. The journey she had mapped out in private was now reflected in the account summary. She breathed in, slow and deep, and exhaled until her lungs were empty. The cycle was complete. Rachel paced the small perimeter of her office. The floorboards creaked under her weight, a rhythmic sound that anchored her thoughts. She looked back at the desk. The 7 digits remained on the screen, but the number itself felt secondary to the mechanism that produced it. She thought of her parents, the decades of long hours that never broke the paycheck-to-paycheck cycle. She had once viewed that cycle as a permanent trap, an unsolvable puzzle. Now, the solution stood clear. It was never about a secret formula or a stroke of luck. It was the deliberate rejection of the appearance of wealth. While her peers spent their commissions on temporary luxury, she had converted hers into assets. She had traded the visible status of expensive vacations and cars for the invisible reality of options. The recruiting industry had merely been the engine. Her discipline was the fuel. She touched the edge of her bookshelf, tracing the spines of the investment guides she had read years ago. Every commission check had been a choice, a small unit of freedom diverted from consumption into compounding growth. The math was simple: earn, save, invest, repeat. She stood in the center of the room, looking at the door, realizing that the habit she built had become her permanent reality. Rachel reached out and pressed the lid of the laptop down. The screen glowed for a fraction of a second before the room plunged into the deep, indigo shadows of twilight. The hum of the cooling fan died away, leaving the office in absolute silence. She pushed the chair back, the wheels rolling smoothly across the hardwood, and stood up. Her legs felt grounded, steady, and entirely her own. She walked toward the window, her footsteps soft on the floor. Outside, the skyline was beginning to blur as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in streaks of muted violet and gold. She rested her hands against the cool glass of the window pane. She watched the light fade from the buildings and the streets below. There was no urgency to return to the desk. There was no pending task, no quota to meet, and no commute to dread. The cycle of earning, saving, and investing had bought her the one thing she had sought from the very beginning: the ability to exist without the need for an escape. She stood there for a long time as the sky darkened, watching the city lights flicker to life one by one. Her future was no longer an abstract goal on a screen. It was a tangible space she now occupied, entirely within her command.